New Year's Eve has always been my favorite holiday. There's something magical about it. The countdown, the celebration, the feeling of starting fresh. This year, though, the magic was replaced by something darker. Something I can't explain. It started with an invitation. I wasn't planning to go out. After a long year, I just wanted to spend a quiet evening at home, watching the countdown on TV with a glass of wine. But around 6 p.m., I received a text from an unknown number. You're invited to the party of the century. 23 Hamilton Street. Don't miss it. I didn't recognize the address, and I had no idea who sent the message. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, but something about it intrigued me. Maybe it was the promise of a party, or maybe I was just curious. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. 23 Hamilton Street turned out to be an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. It was huge and looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were dark, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. But there were cars parked along the street, and faint music was coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment before walking up to the door. It opened before I could knock. A man in a black suit greeted me, his face pale and gaunt, his smile too wide. "Welcome," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The inside of the house was completely different from the outside. The lights were dim, but the place was packed with people, all dressed in elegant, vintage-style clothing. The air smelled of champagne and perfume, and a live band played soft, haunting music in the corner. "Enjoy yourself," the man said, before disappearing into the crowd. At first, the party was normal. People were drinking, laughing, and dancing. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and tried to relax. But as the night went on, I started to notice strange things. There were clocks everywhere, on the walls, on tables, even hanging from the ceiling. They all showed different times, their hands spinning erratically. And the guests, they didn't seem quite right. Their smiles were too fixed, their laughter too hollow. I tried to strike up a conversation with a woman standing near the bar, but when she turned to look at me, her face seemed to flicker, like a glitching screen. I blinked, and she was normal again, smiling politely. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said, gesturing to the room. I nodded, not knowing what to say. As the clock approached midnight, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with something I couldn't describe. I decided I'd had enough. I made my way toward the door, but the man in the black suit appeared in front of me. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm not feeling well," I said, trying to sound casual. He tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "It's almost midnight. You should stay for the countdown." Before I could protest, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Midnight. The guests gathered in the main hall, forming a circle around a massive grandfather clock. Its hands moved normally now, ticking loudly as the seconds counted down. I stood at the edge of the room, unsure of what to do. 10. The guests chanted in unison, their voices eerily synchronized. 9. I felt a wave of dizziness, the room spinning around me. 8. The lights dimmed, and shadows seemed to stretch across the walls. 7. The clocks began to chime, their sounds overlapping into a deafening cacophony. 6. I tried to back away, but the crowd pressed in closer. 5. The man in the black suit appeared beside me, his eyes gleaming. 4. "You're part of this now," he whispered. 3. I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, a hand, skeletal and strong. 2. The guests turned to face me, their eyes black and hollow. 1. The lights went out, and the last thing I heard was the sound of the clock striking midnight. I woke up in my bed, the sunlight streaming through the window. My clothes from the night before were gone, replaced with a plain white gown. At first, I thought it had all been a dream, but when I checked my phone, there was a new message from the same unknown number. "Welcome to the party. See you next year." I looked down at my wrist and saw it, a faint, black mark in the shape of a clock. The hands were moving. The mark on my wrist wasn't a tattoo. It moved like the hands of a real clock, ticking away the seconds. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I tried scrubbing it off, but it wouldn't budge. By mid-morning, I started feeling off. My chest felt tight, like I was running out of air, and my thoughts kept drifting back to the party, to the guests, to the man in the black suit. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But as the day went on, I noticed something else. Time around me seemed different. The hours dragged, but the mark on my wrist moved faster than it should have. By 3 p.m., it was already nearing midnight. I started to panic. At exactly 6 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. Time is running out. Return to 23 Hamilton Street before midnight. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I didn't want to go back, but something deep inside me, a pull I couldn't explain, told me I had no choice. The mark on my wrist was proof enough. It had reached 11 p.m., and the ticking was louder now, echoing in my ears no matter where I went. I arrived at 23 Hamilton Street just before midnight. The house looked exactly as it had the night before, its windows dark, the overgrown yard untouched. This time, the door opened before I even reached the steps. The man in the black suit stood there, his hollow smile wider than ever. "Welcome back," he said, gesturing for me to enter. The air inside was colder than I remembered, and the whispers started the moment I crossed the threshold. The party was gone. The house was empty, its once grand interior now decayed and crumbling. The chandeliers were broken, the walls covered in thick, dark stains. But the clocks remained. They were everywhere, ticking in perfect unison, their hands all pointing to 1 minute before midnight. In the center of the room stood the man in the black suit. Behind him was the massive grandfather clock from the night before, its face cracked, its pendulum swinging unnaturally fast. "You're late," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I don't know what's happening," I stammered. "What do you want from me?" He stepped closer, his eyes like black voids. "You accepted the invitation. You joined the celebration. Now you must pay the price." "What price?" I demanded, backing away. He pointed to the mark on my wrist. "Time is a currency, and you spent more than you had. Now you belong to the clock." I shook my head, refusing to believe him. "This isn't real. This can't be real." The man laughed, a low, chilling sound. "Reality is relative. Midnight approaches, and your time is almost up." The clocks began to chime, each one louder than the last. 10. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. 9. The mark on my wrist burned, the ticking deafening now. 8. The man in the black suit raised a hand, and the room began to spin. 7. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. 6. The grandfather clock loomed over me, its cracked face glowing with an eerie light. 5. You can't fight it, the man whispered. 4. The air grew thick, and my vision blurred. 3. I felt myself being pulled toward the clock, an invisible force dragging me closer. 2. The man's smile widened. "See you next year." 1. The pendulum stopped, and the room went completely dark. When I woke up, I was standing in a crowd of elegantly dressed people. The music was soft and haunting, the air filled with the scent of champagne and perfume. The house was no longer decayed. It was alive again, vibrant and buzzing with energy. I looked down at my wrist. The mark was gone, but when I glanced at my reflection in a nearby mirror, I froze. The face staring back at me wasn't mine. It was the face of the man in the black suit, his hollow eyes glinting with amusement. And behind me, the guests began to chant, "Welcome to the party." This time, I was the host. The room was alive with celebration, but I felt trapped in a nightmare. My reflection in the mirror, the pale face of the man in the black suit, stared back at me, a cruel smile frozen on its lips. I turned away, heart pounding, and surveyed the party. The guests moved gracefully, laughing and dancing, but their faces weren't quite right. They flickered, glitching between youthful beauty and something older, more sinister. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. Instead, I was drawn to the center of the room, where the massive grandfather clock stood. Its pendulum swayed in slow, deliberate arcs, and the ticking seemed to resonate within my chest. "You're the host now," a voice whispered behind me. I turned and saw her, a woman in an elegant vintage gown, her face shifting like the others. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled, a bittersweet expression. "You invited them. You keep the party alive. And at midnight, you collect the price." The words chilled me. I remembered the man in the black suit, his cryptic warnings, his hollow eyes. Now I was in his place. The clocks on the walls began to spin, their hands racing toward midnight. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, the laughter growing louder, more manic. I tried to speak, to plead with the guests, but my voice was swallowed by the chaos. The grandfather clock struck 11, and I felt it, a weight, a pulling sensation deep within me. It was the house, drawing on my energy, feeding off my time. "Don't fight it," the woman whispered. "You can't stop it." But I had to try. As the clock struck 11:45, I began to move through the crowd, searching for a way out. The guests turned to watch me, their flickering faces now twisted with suspicion. The walls of the house seemed to shift, the doors and windows vanishing as I approached them. "You can't leave," the woman said, appearing beside me. "You're bound to the clock." "Why?" I demanded. "Why me?" She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Because you accepted the invitation. And now, you must pay the price." "No," I said, my voice firm. "I won't." The grandfather clock struck 11:55. The room grew colder, the lights dimming. The guests formed a circle around me, their laughter now a low, menacing hum. The man in the black suit, my reflection, appeared within the clock's cracked face, his hollow eyes watching me with amusement. "Time's almost up," he said, his voice echoing in my mind. The clock struck 11:59. I felt the pull intensify, dragging me toward the center of the room. The guests began to chant, their voices rising in unison. 10, 9, 8. I clenched my fists, refusing to let the house take me. 7, 6, 5. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with tension. 4, 3, 2. With all my strength, I lunged toward the grandfather clock, grabbing the pendulum. The guests screamed, their voices blending into a deafening roar. 1. The clock struck midnight, but instead of the chime, there was a deafening crack. The pendulum snapped in my hands, and the room was flooded with blinding light. The guests froze, their forms flickering wildly before disintegrating into shadows. The house groaned, its walls splintering and collapsing around me. I fell to the floor, clutching the broken pendulum as everything dissolved into silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the sidewalk outside 23 Hamilton Street. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot. The mark on my wrist had returned, but it was faint now, barely visible. I stood up, trembling, and glanced at my reflection in a puddle. My face was my own again, but I could still hear the faint ticking of a clock in the back of my mind. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed. A new message appeared. "Congratulations, host. The cycle begins again next year." I dropped the phone and ran, but deep down I knew the truth. I could never truly escape.